90% of an iceberg is underwater, yet we mostly pay attention to the bit that sticks up. The same is true for proficiency in Chinese. Speaking ability is easy to see, but relies on a much larger system underneath. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about improving speaking ability in Chinese and how that can sometimes be a little bit counterintuitive. As mentioned in the introduction, your Chinese proficiency can be said to be like an iceberg, where some things stick up over the water and are easy to see, and other things remain invisible underneath. Your speaking ability is very visible and immediately obvious to people who listen to you. Everybody can hear your tones and which words you choose and how you string these words together into sentences. It's easy to believe that the best way to improve your speaking ability is simply to speak more. If the visible part of the iceberg is not big enough, then expand it. So, if your pronunciation is wobbly, speak more. And if your sentences come out wrong, speak more. And if people don't understand what you're trying to say in conversations, speak more. There is a certain amount of truth to this in general when learning things, including languages, because you want to practice what you want to get good at. If you want to get better at running, you run. If you want to get better at listening, you listen, and so on. When it comes to speaking and writing a foreign language, though, this is not the whole story, and it's actually not the best advice either. This is where the iceberg analogy comes in handy, because your speaking ability is what sticks up over the surface, and the much larger part below the surface is the system that makes this possible. The words and phrases that you understand, the patterns you've encountered many times, your feel for the language, and the sound categories you have built, and so on. This system is largely implicit, meaning that you might not be aware of it or be able to explain it, and it is based on listening and reading. It is based on comprehensible input. So, in other words, the way you grow your iceberg is by listening and reading more. And in this episode, I'm focusing on speaking ability, and so therefore you largely grow your iceberg by listening more. What I say here is true for reading and writing as well, but since I don't want to say reading or listening and speaking or writing all the time, let's stick to speaking ability. Just because the system in your head that allows you to speak Chinese is built on input, that doesn't mean that speaking is useless. Speaking practice can still enable you to say what you already know more fluently, reveal gaps in your proficiency, and train certain strategies you need to succeed in real conversations. But what you yourself say in a conversation can, by logic, only be based on things you already know. It does not build the system. Information about the Chinese language and how it works can only enter your brain through your ears or eyes. So there we have it, the Chinese proficiency iceberg. If you want to improve that bit that sticks up, your speaking ability, you should spend a certain amount focusing on speaking explicitly, but you should also spend most of your time growing the system, growing the whole iceberg, because then naturally more of it will also stick up. The best way, or according to some the only way to grow the iceberg, is through comprehensible input. This means listening to or reading Chinese you largely understand and can make sense of. Simply listening to more Chinese will not immediately improve your speaking, but it is a prerequisite for improving your speaking, and over time, all those hours spent listening will pay off when it comes to speaking ability as well, especially if paired with some focus on speaking practice. Remember, I'm not saying that you should never practice speaking, I'm just saying that practicing speaking in and of itself is not enough. Focusing on speaking practice directly is a bit like trying to shape the tip of the iceberg. This would include things like speaking lessons, recording yourself and analyzing your pronunciation, or drilling tone pairs. It could also include preparing for certain speaking tasks such as oral presentations, conversations, etc., or getting feedback on any of these activities. This can be very effective, especially when your iceberg is quite large, so you have learned a lot of Chinese, but you can't access it quickly enough. The mistake is to treat it as the default answer to all speaking problems. Sometimes the problem is indeed that you need to practice more speaking, but often the problem is that the system underneath is underdeveloped. You're trying to produce language that you simply haven't heard enough, or you're trying to pronounce things you don't know how they are supposed to sound because you haven't listened enough. When you listen to large amounts of Chinese that you can understand, you develop a mental model for how Chinese works, what it's supposed to sound like, and so on. This is not the same as memorizing grammar patterns or using flashcards to learn vocabulary. It's about providing your brain with enough data to know what is right. One of the problems with studying grammar explicitly and using flashcards to learn vocabulary is that what you actually need is to see words and patterns in meaningful contexts many, many, many times. And this context should also be different, not the same one every time, as is the case when using flashcards. The number of times you need to hear a new word or grammar pattern to make it your own and to also use it when you speak can vary dramatically depending on the word and many other factors, but on average it's much larger than people think. And this is also why it takes time to build your system, and why you shouldn't expect lots of listening to immediately transfer into better speaking. This is also why studying a new word and then immediately trying to use it yourself can be so frustrating. You might understand the basic definition, but since your brain doesn't have the data about how this word is used, your attempts to use it will often be wrong. You don't really know where this word belongs, what other words it likes appearing with, how formal it is, what it can and cannot be used to say, and how native speakers react to it. While you can look some of these things up, you can only learn a fraction of what you need to know about words through dictionary lookups. Most of the rest will have to come from listening and reading. To illustrate this, I want to share a personal example from a class I took many years ago. This was when I was an intermediate student and I took a course in Chinese idioms. The lessons basically consisted of the teacher introducing an idiom that I had never heard of, perhaps by introducing the story it's based on, talking a little bit about it, and so on. She would also explain how to use it and then let us have a go. So I would try, get it wrong, try again, get it wrong again, and so on until someone gave up. And then we would move on to the next idiom. The problem here wasn't that the teacher was incompetent, she wasn't, that chongyu are bad or that corrections are useless, but that I was being asked to use language that hadn't really entered my system yet. I learned a lot in that course by listening to the stories and explanations and talking about these things in Chinese, but I don't think I learned how to use any of the chongyu covered correctly. For more about learning chongyu in Chinese, check out episode 194, and as usual, I will also put links in the show notes. The principle we're talking about here is not limited to vocabulary, so pronunciation, for example, is also part of the visible tip of the iceberg. What people hear when you speak Chinese is what you say, but that also depends on some categories and targets that you've built below the surface through listening. If you want to pronounce Mandarin well, you need to listen to naturally spoken Chinese in many different contexts. You can't achieve naturally sounding Mandarin relying solely on reading pinyin, studying some pronunciation theory, and drilling tones. As mentioned earlier, the takeaway from this article shouldn't be that speaking practice is pointless. Knowing something, in the sense that it's in your system, is not enough. You also need to be able to use it quickly enough for real communication. If it takes you 10 seconds to find the word you need, it doesn't really matter that you know it because it's too slow to use in a normal conversation. The same can be true for pronunciation. Sometimes you might know what it's supposed to sound like, but you speak so rarely that the sounds are hard to produce. This is where direct speaking practice shines. It helps you retrieve words faster, put them together more naturally, and pronounce things in a smoother way. Indeed, one way of defining fluency is that it is about how well you can use what you already know, something we discussed in more detail in episode 99. Speaking with other people also teaches you strategies that you won't really learn simply by listening. How do you ask someone to slow down or to repeat what they said when you don't understand? And how do you repair something you said when you think the other person misunderstood what you meant? You also need to learn to talk around words you don't know and keep a conversation going, and these things are best learned through speaking. It's worth noting that the kind of speaking practice I'm advocating here is communicative. It means that you are actually trying to say something to a real person in some sense. It doesn't have to be live, it could be something you record for someone else to listen to, but it could also and should probably mostly be about real conversations. Reading sentences aloud or writing down dialogues to perform in front of the class, etc. don't count. The reason is, of course, that the strategies won't apply if you don't actually want to convey something and if the person you're speaking to is not actually interested in hearing what you have to say. While we're on the topic of conversations, I think it's good to clear something up. When I said earlier that speaking doesn't really build the system and that the only way to build the system is through comprehensible input, some of you might have thought that, wait a second, conversations contain both speaking and listening. This is true, so when I say that speaking won't build the system, I refer to your side of the conversation, or any kind of drilling, practicing, or speaking that you might do on your own. Still, I think that for most people, conversations can't really be the main source of input, and there are several reasons for this. First, it's simply hard to find people to talk to enough to build enough input to build the system successfully this way. It requires you to live in a Chinese-speaking environment and live your life in Chinese. Another problem with conversations is that even if, technically speaking, half of it might be listening, you spend a lot of time thinking about what you are going to say when the other person is speaking, and focusing enough on what they are saying is tricky if you are also supposed to take part. Whereas if you just listen, you can focus 100% of what's being said. For us second language learners, processing spoken Mandarin is not easy, and we just don't have the bandwidth to pay attention to everything at once, and like I said, if we also have to speak ourselves, there is even less left to focus on what we hear. Don't take this as advice to stay away from conversations, of course. The point here is that conversations usually aren't enough to give you enough input to build the system. Another thing that some of you might have thought about when listening to the episode so far is advice about speaking from day one, as opposed to some other people who claim that you should focus on listening and that speaking will emerge naturally. So essentially, some people regret that they didn't speak more early on and they recommend you to do so, and other people say the opposite, that you should probably listen more instead, which is essentially what I'm arguing in this episode. Depending on your background, I think both these can be true. People who focus a lot on listening and reading and learning words early on and don't speak much will find that direct speaking practice has a lot of benefits. On the other hand, learners who mostly speak and don't spend enough time on listening and reading will also find this limiting eventually. No matter which method you use, you need a lot of input. I'm not arguing for a silent period here where you refuse to speak before you are ready. Communicating early is useful, motivating, and fun, but what I am saying is that problems with speaking ability are usually not solved only by speaking more. As a footnote, it's worth mentioning that the advice to speak from day one is mainly aimed at people who have learned languages in formal institutions, such as high school or maybe university. The problem there isn't that students get too much comprehensible input though and never speak. The problem is that they are learning about the language rather than learning the language. So they might memorize lots of vocabulary, grammar rules, and explain the language in their native language and so on. But this is not related to the question we're talking about here. Before we wrap up this episode, let's have a practical look at the question of what you should do if you want to improve your speaking ability in Mandarin. If you often know what you want to say but have no idea how to say it in Chinese, you probably need more input. If your sentences feel like translation, or if you keep guessing how words are used or how to say things in Chinese, or need to look things up all the time, you need to build the system through comprehensible input. Listen more. On the other hand, if you understand a lot but freeze when speaking, or if you can form sentences but too slowly to be useful, you need more communicative speaking practice. Try to choose activities where you mostly use Chinese you've already learned. So for example, you can retell things you have already listened to, you can summarize something that you've read, or discuss topics you are already familiar with. This will encourage language that's already in your system to break the surface and become available when you speak. So to conclude this episode, speaking more can help you speak better, but only within limits. It can make you faster, more confident, and better at using what you already know. It can reveal gaps in your knowledge and prepare you for real conversations. In other words, it can help you shape the part of the iceberg that sticks up over the water so it becomes more useful. But the iceberg itself is built through input. If the hidden system is underdeveloped, focusing only on the visible part will not solve the problem. You need more Chinese in your head, and that means more listening and reading. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.